Welcome everybody tonight. I know everybody is starting to sort of flood in to this webinar. We're so excited to have you. This is just the second in a brand new series on Cleveland civics and Cleveland history that's being brought to you sort of co-sponsored by the Cleveland History Center, the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, and the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. I'm Karen Lawrence. I'm the Assistant Director of the Lifelong Learning Program there at Case Western. And so I just wanted to sort of thank you all for being here. We're really excited to start the series. The reception of the series has just been astounding already. I'm so pleased. And so we're just hopefully going to continue the series on in perpetuity. And the second one is just such a home run for us to be able to have all of these distinguished gentlemen here tonight to with us. And so just a little bit of info about how these webinars work. If you haven't been to one before, you will be able to see and hear our panelists. They will not be able to see and hear you, but we would still like you guys to participate by typing in your questions, either in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and then we'll be getting those to our moderator, Mark. And so with that, I will introduce Mark so that you can actually listen to the people that you are here to listen to tonight. Mark Naymik covered government, politics, campaigns, and all sorts of everything in between for the Plain Dealer and then Cleveland.com between 2000 and 2019. He was a Metro columnist in his last 6 years there before joining the City Daily paper. He spent nearly a decade working for alternate weekly newspapers in Cleveland and Philadelphia. And he just recently joined WKYC Channel 3 as a general assignment and enterprise reporter in July of 2019. And so, Mark, thank you so much for moderating this panel tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. I want to thank the sponsors, Case Western Reserve, League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, Michael Barron's efforts, and the Cleveland History Center. I know a good moderator tries to get out of the way, so I will do that very shortly. I think it's worth talking about what happened 20 years ago, because right after this current election's over in 2 weeks, I think we're going to see a real shift towards what's going to happen in 2021. Which would be the end of the now longest serving mayor's term, Mayor Frank Jackson, and we're going to see a big race. I think it's going to draw on a lot of the issues we're going to talk about tonight, from development, tax issues, of course, racial unrest, poverty, all of these things are connected. So I think the best place to start for now, and we're going to be happy to jump around when we see questions come in and just kind of go where it naturally takes us. But that is to start in 1989. That is, the year Michael R. White was elected, beating a mentor of his, George Forbes, and we'll talk a little bit about that race and dynamic leading up to it. And then he served what at the time was 3 terms, making him the longest serving mayor in the history of the city. He left a large legacy. And that's a neutral term. I think it's important to point out. That's not good or bad. There is a legacy, and we'll be talking about that tonight. I'm joined by a former colleague, Brent Larkin, former director of editorial pages at the Plain Dealer, longtime reporter there and at the Cleveland Press, and still a hardy scribe out there now. Also, joining us is Leon Bibb from Channel 3, who before COVID, got to see him a few cubes away in my short time. I've now worked in my car longer than I have at Channel 3, because we've just passed that 7-month mark. And of course, Tom Beres, who I drive to his street every day when I was at the station. Tom, a longtime politics reporter at Channel 3, and for those who don't know, I think Tom had the record at being the longest employee of Channel 3 as a reporter, and almost anywhere in town with one station. So with that, I think we should start 1989. Maybe Brent, I know you were covering that race closely. If you could start us by just painting a picture a little bit of what that race was like leading up to it.
I covered 15 mayor's races in my many years of doing this. That's not a figure I walk around with, carry around with in my head. I use my fingers to count a little while ago. And 1989 and 1977 of those 15, and maybe 1971 also, they were the only three electrifying political contests that mayor's races that I've covered. And the 1989 race was full of intrigue. There was a Mike White emerging from the primary it was not a small surprise. It was an enormous surprise. And he was not expected to be in the runoff. 1989 began with the relationship with George Forbes, who was the longtime most powerful council president Cleveland's ever had. And Mike White was his trusted ally. And earlier in the decade, Michael had done some really important, dirty political work, if you will, not illegal, but tough political work for George. And George promised Michael he was not going to run for mayor in 1989. Mike White got in, and George at the later changed his mind, got in, changed their relationship forever, for the worse. It's non-existent today, but it was a race where he was a surprise second place finisher, and he and George ended up in the runoff. And on the night of the primary election, the race was effectively over. I knew it. Everybody covering the race knew it. The two finalists knew it, because George Forbes had built up too many enemies on the West Side over 17 years in as council president, and it was a race that was filled with a lot of drama and a lot of negativity.
And Brent, I think the stats are that Mike White had about 95% of what we would say is the white vote. At then, the city was a little more segregated by pure geography on the West Side.
Yeah, George. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
And so that, certainly made a difference. And we knew for a long time, you always had to get about 30% from the other side of the river if you were ever going to win in a race. But before we go forward, Brent, more on that, I think the point of him running, Leon, you talked to him, covered him when you were in Columbus. You've mentioned before, you knew this guy was going to run, and if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was a reporter in Columbus at the NBC station WCMH Channel 4 in Columbus in the early 70s. I just gotten out of Bowling Green State University and a graduate school, at least, after the Army and all of that. And I would interview Mike all the time in the mid 70s. Mike was the student body president at Ohio State University. And whenever there was a demonstration, we would run over with our cameras and microphones, and we would interview Mike. And after we did the interview, Mike would always say, we grew up in the same neighborhood. Mike and I grew up about 3 blocks away from each other. Even we're in the same Boy Scout troop. That's how far we go back together. And Michael told me, he said, one day I'm going back to Cleveland, Leon, and I'm going to run against Mildred Madison in our old neighborhood, Glenville neighborhood ward, Ward 24 or Ward 25, whatever it was in those days. He says, I'm going to defeat Mildred. I'm going to spend a couple of times on city council, and then I'm going to run for mayor, and I'm going to beat the mayor, and I'm going to run, and after that, I'm going to be the governor. Now, he told me that. Now, the thing about it is the two of us with big afros flowing in the wind in those days, in the 1970s, me, a reporter, and he, the student body president, holding some sort of a demonstration. When he told me that, the thing about it is, I believed it. I mean, for a college student saying I'm going to be the mayor of Cleveland one day, I actually believed it because he said it with such punch, and he said it in that Mike White way, and he was just kind of feeling nostalgic about the city of Cleveland. So that was my opening relationship as a professional with Mike White, outside of being in the Boy Scout troop and being in neighborhood kids. I'm a couple of years older than Mike. So, but outside of that, that's how he and I got to know each other.
Well, thanks, Leon. That gives us a little sense, and we'll probably touch on more of the early days later on. I guess I would have been really blown away if he said he was going to own an alpaca farm someday. So
He never mentioned
later.
that, although he did say he was an agriculture major at Ohio State.
Yes, that is true. And so bringing us back to election night, Tom, no doubt you were paying attention, and there were, a lot of people you covered in that primary, including Tim Hagan leading up to this final runoff. What were you seeing and hearing the night of the election?
Well, again, just to review the cast of characters here, you had three well-known, better-known white candidates: County Commissioner Tim Hagan, Ralph Burke, who was son of a former mayor and school board president, and Benny Bonanno, a perennial candidate for anything but well-known, very popular ethnic candidate in the city of Cleveland. And I think when the race started out, most of the handicappers guessed that it would be a George Forbes, Benny Bonanno ultimate runoff. But what ultimately happened as the votes started to come in, you could see the three white candidates conducted a circular firing squad, basically to get all negating each other and enabling Mike White to vault into the final two and into the final election. And again, the thing that was remarkable about Mike White, he had little money. He had basically a nucleus of 8 or 9 kids from Oberlin who were energetic, diehard, supported him 110%. And he simply worked 25 hours a day on the campaign. So I don't know that he actually had the dots connected and all figured out that this is how it was going to go. But again, the vote ultimately was a referendum on George Forbes, who was so abrasive and so much of a bully and had done so much to antagonize the white community on the West Side with the way funds were distributed. So when it came to election day, the white community, which had never had a chance to vote on George Forbes for or against for anything, and just kind of rose up in unison and backed Mike White. But again, the flip side was did he ultimately win because this was a community thumbs down on George Forbes? And so Mike White, the great election night story is Mike White gives his acceptance speech, and then at 1:30 in the morning convenes all of his staff in a ballroom someplace, not to have a festive celebration, but to start going to work on his agenda and nose to the grindstone right away.
Well, that's a good segue into that agenda, which we know includes quite a bit from airport to schools and development and inner city housing. And Brent, maybe if you remember, what were the first things that you saw that administration try to take on?
Mark, can I go back for 10 seconds?
Yes.
I neglected to mention that, and Tom knows this also, and Leon also, a key development in that campaign was the plain dealer endorsing Mike White. Prior to the primary election, no one expected it. I was a columnist at the time. Marianne Charkey was the editorial page editor. But Benny Bonanno was the candidate to beat, and Benny beat himself, but that endorsement helped propel candidate Mike White past Bonanno by just a little bit and got him into the runoff. The first, Mike White had as good a first term as mayor as anyone I've ever covered. He actually had the best first term. George Voinovich inherited a mess, and his first term was very different. But the first thing out of the box was Gateway, because that vote was in June or May, I think, of 1990. He took office. Mayor White did a lot of good things in the first term. The one that got the item that got the most attention was Gateway. He had a lot of political capital. He spent it all. Gateway was clobbered in the city of Cleveland. But had it not passed, the Indians would have been gone, and who knows what would have happened to the Cavaliers. But that was his, right out of the gate, that's the issue he tackled. That and redlining in the bank redlining in inner city neighborhoods.
Tom, do you remember, I guess, aside from Gateway, any issues or how quickly he started looking at the tax abatement issues in the housing that we saw? Really not anything like it since, in terms of the number of houses being built, in central neighborhood and in what we would call the inner city. We obviously have a lot of new housing now between condos, but those are all now, built up for, for far wealthier residents.
Yeah, obviously he wanted to build the same kind of quality houses that people in the suburbs could live in, but wanted them to build them in the inner city, the same quality, the same value, and so began giving extraordinary offers to builders. I mean, the city is a huge property owners, a lot of vacant lots. Put those lots up for sale for $1 a holler, a buck a lot. And I think developers were kind of wary about this promotion. But then when the long-term tax abatements and the other incentives were piled one on top of another, it became so attractive for builders. I mean, Mayor White would tell stories about how he was, being accosted by developers at public outings, trying to get his attention for prospective projects. And the exact number, some reason 233 sticks in my mind is the actual number of new housing projects or developments that actually were constructed on his watch, which I believe was more housing than had been built in Cleveland going back to the Korean War. Just harkening back to a quick Gateway point. I mean, the fact of the matter is, he came into office and this was dumped in his lap. This wasn't something that he had a plan for. This was something that he and Tim Hagan over at the county had to come together with. Fay Vincent, the baseball commissioner, came to town and basically said, "New stadium or you don't have a baseball team." And they had to put this together under the gun, under extreme pressure, and again, a new political face. But this also sort of introduced the idea of the region and the county taking on big projects like this. Again, a lot of people can argue that maybe the terms that he gave the Indians and the Cavaliers were too generous. Like, why shouldn't they pay property taxes on the stadium? But ultimately, had Gateway not been built, we'd have been reading about the Tampa Bay or New Orleans or some other Indians, soon to be something else somewhere else.
Right.
Leon, on the point of the housings, you grew up in the city and you had that connection with the mayor. Did you ever get a sense of where that was in his priority list and how close to his heart? It seemed to be very close given the houses and the push that he made on that.
Well, it was very close to his heart. He talked about growing up in the city, the same generation that I grew up in the city, and the housing stock was wonderful. The neighborhood we lived in, that Glenville neighborhood, was absolutely wonderful. And I know that he was trying to bring that back, and even still, the housing stock, the bones of many of those houses in the Glenville neighborhood built around. My street was built in 1920. The bones of those houses are still good. So I think he wanted to capitalize on rebuilding in that neighborhood. And one of the things I remember him saying in later interviews, he said he wanted to build quality houses in the city, houses that if you cut them off at the basement and lifted the house up and moved it to the suburbs, that house would fit in very nicely in any suburb of Cuyahoga County. He said he wanted quality stuff. And I think he really pushed very hard for that.
I bring that up because we know we can talk a lot about the Gateway and the downtown transformation from the flats, the warehouse district, to the stadium projects, because we know then as years went on, he was always being tagged as being, taking care of downtown and not the neighborhoods. And I think some of that does get lost. I mean, politically, it's always an argument that seems to be made and maybe actually has some legs to it. But it is a point I didn't want to forget as we dive back into some of the downtown development. We know the Flats went through multiple reincarnations in the 80s when it at one time was, the New Orleans, that we would like to portray it in all the glossy brochures. And then it became basically just a drunk punch fest. And then it died off. And now it's obviously been reborn long after Mayor White. But those development issues, aside from Gateway, were big. Probably none bigger than really the airport. And at one time, we believed we were going to need bigger, longer runways. And that was a major impediment to our future growth, they thought. Little did they realize that they would make, faster and more efficient airplanes, and then we wouldn't have a need for the big ones anyway. But maybe Brent, all the players involved on the airport issue, and that this is now really relevant given that the IX Center is has closed. It's Cleveland's to worry about, plus there's some unpaid bills there. But, that airport issue, how much did Mike White and then Brook Park Mayor Tom Coyne get along or not get along in figuring this out?
You know the answer to that. They did not get along at all. In hindsight, Cleveland got fleeced on the airport deal. But because, as you noted, Mark, I think Cleveland gave up NASA Lewis, NASA Glenn Research Center, all those six-figure jobs in return for the IX Center and the property that the mayor wanted for a new runway up to Asia. The mayor was onto something at the time, and he did not, as you noted, again, he did not know that air service was going to change dramatically. And he had a vision. His vision was not crazy at all. It just didn't work out. They overpaid they lost, Brook Park got the better of Cleveland on that land swap. And that doesn't necessarily mean he was wrong at the time.
Right. And I've got a question on this development issue, and it jumps us off from the airport, and maybe Tom, the name Dick Jacobs, of course, big player in development at the time, then owner of the Indians, especially through the Gateway era. Hear the crowds roar in 1994. That was the slogan. But Dick Jacobs and his play in all of this development downtown.
Well, let's see. We have the Galleria, which I believe is a Jacobs undertaking. This was a time when downtown shopping was coming back in other parts of the country. And I believe they envisioned the same sort of traffic and activity here, which never really materialized. It's gone through several renditions and makeovers, and again, I more reflection on me perhaps, but I'd be hard pressed to tell you what significant tenants are still in that building. Dick Jacobs also had a vision for something that never happened. He wanted to build a skyscraper with one of the banks that wound up being folded into a merger, and so the whole project never happened. But yeah, he was a key player, and he was a very, very good friend of George Forbes, and a lot of the development, a lot of the funding for those projects came on Mr. Forbes' watch.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the timing. He also did Key Tower, did the Marriott and the Galleria. but I'm not sure if that wasn't started before Michael became mayor.
Oh,
I think you know, there were a lot of things that were in play before he became mayor. The Rock Hall, though I believe it opened on his watch.
But definitely started by Voinovich getting the money.
Right. And I think actually Mayor White said that the job of a mayor was to sort of keep building on top of what previous mayors had built. So he gets maybe more credit than is due him for the Rock Hall and the Science Center. And well, then we can get into Brown Stadium and the lakefront, but that's a whole nother.
Well, we are, and that is one development that you can put at the feet of the mayor. It's one that people have speculated on quite a bit, or not speculated, but have talked about and reanalyzed about whether or not that Brown Stadium should have ever been built on the lakefront. I did a story for Channel 3 when I first started last year, where I revisited the stadium with Fred Nance, and who was a major influencer in the mayor's, I guess, kitchen cabinet and business cabinet, and a lawyer for the city, working for a private law firm. And he said there is no regret, no question that they had no choice but to build there, given the time frame from the Browns, from the NFL, in order to keep a team. People have always speculated, well, why did we not build it away from the lakefront and open that up? It just, in his view and in the mayor's view at the time, there was no other option. They had a clock.
Well, Mark, they had looked at that piece of land catty corner to Progressive Field over there, where there's that that BP gas station right on the corner. They'd looked at that, but it was so many different parcels of land, it would take too long to buy up all of those parcels of land. Municipal Stadium, the city already held right there on the lakefront. So they just tore down the old stadium to build a new stadium because, as you said, time was of the essence if we were to get a Browns team back by 1999, which we did. So they had to go with the land that they had.
And that's a great point. And that was the driving factor. And hey, I do have a comment from one of the folks tuning in tonight that maybe we'll try to check, and maybe our memories are hazy. They believe that the Galleria may have even landed before the mayor got into office. So we don't know. I'm not sure we were giving the mayor necessarily credit for that. We were talking about it in the context of the Dick Jacobs project, but it certainly came online.
Yeah, no, he's correct. He's correct. It preceded Mayor White's, but I wanted to put it on Dick Jacobs' plate.
Absolutely. And on the stadium, Brent, the issue was talked about a lot relative to the Browns, and there a lot of debate over whether Modell should have left or had to leave, or was he offered a deal? But that's the past. The mayor built that stadium. Do you think it was the right move at the time, given the context in that moment?
Never going anywhere else, because the mayor was never open-minded about it. I thought at the time the mayor was right. I'm not too sure now. We had to build this in a big hurry. It's a mediocre stadium at best. And eventually I think there's going to be a play to build a new one somewhere else in the not too distant future. If you ask most Clevelanders today who are 50 and over or 60 and over what they remember about Mike White, 90% of them will say he brought the Browns back. He would tell you, I would agree, it was not his finest hour because he's not a sports fan, doesn't care about it. It was an economic development deal for him, as was Gateway. Didn't care about baseball or basketball. But he is remembered. The Browns left on his watch, and through the force of his relentless determination, they came back on his watch. I'm not sure after 21 years of pathetic football, in hindsight, that was that good a deal, but we didn't know that at the time. And he single-handedly took over that effort and was successful.
Well, that whole Save the Browns campaign was just a huge community wide. And again, he able to rally the community around sports issues. And a lot of people, say that, gosh, if only there was a way to get that kind of community-wide support for improving the Cleveland public schools or other more significant issues. But he did a masterful job of basically, I don't want to say intimidating, but basically tell Commissioner Tagliabue, if we get the team to name the colors, or there's going to be a big fight and there's going to be some blood on the floor, and some of it's going to be mine, but a lot of it's going to be yours. And the way that he was able to rally the community to flood the phones and flood the fax machines of virtually shutting down 6 or 7 franchises and paralyzing the NFL's business. I think Commissioner Tagliabue was glad to meet the demands and be done with Mike White's crusade here.
Tom, that was Mike's talent. He was relentless on something like that. And it was more than a Cleveland thing. I mean, with Cleveland schools, it's a city thing. But with the Browns, with the Indians and the Jacobs Field and the ballparks, it was a regional thing. And that was his talent, was to paint that picture and be relentless like a bulldog on Tagliabue's ankle, I'll say ankle, and the NFL till they gave in. And he did say there would be blood on the floor, some his, and a lot of it would be Tagliabue's if the Browns didn't come back.
Well, let's take a jump off on that point, Leon, though, that you mentioned, and Tom, a minute ago about the schools. We have a legacy that exists today of Cleveland City Hall being ultimately in charge for the Cleveland City Schools. And the Mayor White fought to have that control, and it was very controversial at the time. It was a reaction to very dysfunctional school board. That in and of itself could have had a team of beat reporters at the Plain Dealer covering. And he certainly, set that in motion. And now people don't seem to ever even give mind to it under Frank Jackson, that it's still ultimately his responsibility. Brent, do you remember the push for the schools?
Schools required a lot of help from the Ohio General Assembly and the governor at the time, who was George Voinovich. And it didn't sail through the legislature. It had to go to the ballot here. And goodness knows I don't pretend to speak for Mayor White, and he would object to my even trying, but he would probably tell you it was one of the things that he's proudest of, perhaps the proudest of, is trying to change public education in the city. And it was called, and we call it today, mayoral control. Where the mayor appoints school board members. We had a long history of electing people who didn't belong on the school board. One of them, mooned somebody on the way to a Coliseum concert, and we had a collection of assortment of clowns elected to the school board with good last names. And he was right to take a shot at it. And again, he approached that with his approach was relentless, and he got it done.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting now, almost 30 years later from the beginning of that, the schools remain in control of the city. And, they have a levy on the ballot just a couple of weeks from now that, will be the next mayor's legacy as well, good or bad, that if that doesn't pass, there's going to be massive changes, and the next leader of the city is going to have to then re-embrace that idea. Jumping a little bit over on this, maybe somewhat related, people talk about the legacy. It's easy to point to buildings and some of this economic development, housing. But as a legacy, as a second African-American mayor, in his push for racial justice, schools, you could argue, is representative of that. But this question is asking, what was that legacy among the Black community? He may never be remembered like a Lonnie Burton, a former councilman that he once argued with, that is represented the central neighborhood in the projects, who died at a young age of a heart attack, but was very outspoken. What was Mike White's legacy as a African American in a city, then and now largely minority, and still full of high poverty rates, redlining, racial injustice. So I don't ask anyone specific on this, but if someone wants to weigh in on that.
I think when he ran for mayor, I seem to recall a statement where he said he had actually, before he ran for mayor, he'd only been to the West Side maybe once or twice in his entire life.
And still won their vote.
Yeah, that's right. But when he ran for mayor, and again, it made sense politically because of all of the opposition to George Forbes, he made an attempt to, form interracial coalitions, and I think to engage the entire community. I know I saw a not yesterday recent, but a couple of years ago, interview that he did where he talked about the thing that troubled him most is that his kids and their generation are going to wind up having to fight the same fight that he did as student body president at Ohio State and as mayor, in terms of fairness and justice and equity and economic equality. He talked about the importance of African-American presence within the big institutions in town. Said, well, we're doing pretty good on that, but in terms of African-American small businesses and employment opportunity, we're still lagging way behind. I mean, the year after he left office, I believe Cleveland could lay claim to the dubious and unfortunate title of poorest city in big city in the country, and here we are. How many years later, and the same distinction now falls into our lap. I remember a particular episode on the subject of race where the Ku Klux Klan wanted to hold a rally, and he got all kinds of blowback and grief from the African American community, because he came down on the side of the constitutional rights of the Klan to hold the rally. And I remember he took a lot of guff and a lot of criticism for allowing that rally to be held. And then we get into issues with the police union about that also. Him and Bob Beck, and the Ku Klux Klan could change into their rally, bed sheets in the police garage. So that
underneath the Justice Center.
There's one issue where he took a stand for what he thought was right, even though it may not have ingratiated him with a lot of the Black community.
Getting back to the issue of his relationship to the Black community, Michael's personality will you'll never read his name and the word beloved in the same sentence, because he missed class the day they talked about Dale Carnegie, and his personality was not overly endearing the way Carl and Lou Stokes's were. And he doesn't have much of a sense of humor. His colleagues on city council were not particularly fond of him. And I think that is he's the most gifted mayor in the last 40 years
Mhm.
in terms of pure intellectual gifts and drive and a little bit of vision. He's the most gifted mayor since Carl. But he was difficult to like at times.
Well, let's use it.
Here.
But
Let me use that point to go to Leon on, do you think that having that personality was needed at that time and made his legacy what it is, or could he have done it if he was a little softer?
I think he formed the kind of a coalition. Now remember, in '89 when he ran against Forbes, Mike went west to the west of the Cuyahoga River. He was what was called the white candidate, and I don't mean Mike White. He was the white candidate for the white folks because they had disliked George Forbes so much. He was not Forbes, although he defended Forbes in the early days when he was on city council. If you were going to fight George Forbes, you had to fight Councilman Mike White first. He was his chief lieutenant. But Mike was one of those who didn't talk a lot of black, but the way it had been talked by George Forbes. But he put coalitions together to make, I think, black life better generally. It wasn't all the rhetoric. He didn't talk that rhetoric, but he knew where he was going with it. And I don't think you could out-talk Mike. I don't think you could out-intellect Mike. I think Mike White knew where he wanted to go, and he had the gift of gab. He had the gift of putting words together to be able to sell his ideas to anybody. And I think that was part of his success, which later on became part of the black community.
Well, he was a micromanager, and I was going to go to you, Tom, on this. We've all heard the lore, legend or not, or true or not, that he'd hit a pothole on his way to work, and he'd pick up the phone, have that thing filled.
Wanted it fixed by noon.
By noon, right? So that micromanager personality, in some ways, is what turned a lot of people off. There were concerns that development couldn't get done because it needed to go through him rather than trusting the bureaucracy that you're supposed to build. And we can parallel that to today, where some people think that maybe right now in the fourth term of Mayor Jackson, he's the opposite of a micromanager, though things seem to get stuck somewhere. But do you think that helped him, at least?
Well, I mean, when Mike White was mayor, there was never any doubt who was in charge. He was the leader. He was the boss. He was the go-to guy that needed to make the final decision and have the last word. But I think the longer he was in office and the more he got accustomed to being the ultimate word in the power, the less patience he had. Again, he was a very gifted, very persuasive speaker, but it seemed that the longer he was in office, the less time he was willing to spend on persuading you as to why his line of thinking was the correct way and what he wanted to do was the ultimate best solution. And so he sort of developed into a my way or the highway, get on board or else. And I guess he was probably always somewhat abrasive and thin-skinned and not welcoming to dissenting viewpoints. But it seemed the longer he was in office, the more acute that became.
Well, Brent, on that point, how did he turn off half the community midway through second term?
Well, he ran for re-election in '93 against a guy named David Lee Rock, I believe. Got about 80% of the vote. He ran again in '97 against Helen Smith, and it was a little bit closer. I am of the view that that Mayor White's third term was pretty bad. The talent pool at City Hall disappeared. People, as Tom put it pretty diplomatically, he didn't have patience, some people at City Hall were, and in the business community, were treated extremely poorly. You had scandals starting to bubble up with his friends. I mean, you know, Nate Gray was the best man in his wedding, I believe. And Nate went to prison. Twice. Okay. Nate went to prison for about a decade. And in the third term, the airport deal happened in the third term. There isn't a lot to point to in the third term. And it's just a perfect example of a guy perhaps staying one term too long.
But on his style, Brent, before you go on this point, the micromanaging style, how was that viewed outside of City Hall among the developers? And we know he was close to Forest City. They and Sam Miller, we all have written and talked about stories. But that style, what was going on behind the scenes, you know, out there in that middle of the second term where people were just, you know, we always used to hear it as reporters. No one would go on record, but they'd gripe about, you know, the mayor and how hard it was to deal with.
Yes, and he took out some, like very prominent CEOs in town were on the receiving end of that. Hey, let's be honest, there were problems in the Plain Dealer newsroom at the time related to treatment of the mayor. And, you know, an editor came along by the name of Doug Clifton at one point, and that whole tone changed because Doug was to his core, was a great newsman. But yeah, the mayor's relationship with people seeped into the Plain Dealer, and he did not like the coverage that he got from the Plain Dealer in his last 4 or 5 years as mayor.
Leon, was coverage viewed, how did he view coverage in the broadcast media?
Well, I know when he started, I mean, when he started that first term, he was in every newscast. Mike could make 2 appearances in a 30-minute newscast. He could make 2 of them. I mean, if they opened up a swimming pool in the summer in that first term, Mike White would go to the swimming pool, roll up his pants all the way to his knees and wade into the water with the children. And that was good television for those of us who understand how television works. He was that, and he had 2 wonderful terms. I thought he had a pretty good relationship with the television end of it. I know he was always battling the Plain Dealer. I mean, he was always battling you guys at the Plain Dealer. But that third term, as Brent said, is what got him, and the bloom got off the rose at that point. But for the first 8 years, I think he was on a roll because the city was moving in such a great direction. But I remember that when he would talk about micromanaging, I remember there was something that happened with the fire department, and I covered the story of going to the fire department and hearing top fire officials. I don't know if it was the chief or not. Hearing top fire officials hold this news conference. Well, they conference told what they were going to do. And as we were wrapping up our cables and cameras to leave, in walks Mayor Mike White. And Mike White says, everybody come back in. The news conference is still going on. And Mike went over what they had done, and he just did it in his words. And it kind of pushed even the fire department outside of their own story. So he could micromanage it. And I think as far as the news media, some of that began to tarnish some of his image at that time.
Yeah, on that point, Tom, that you would see the mayor pushing back on, whether it's the fire department union or others, his relationship with City Hall and his own bureaucracy wasn't good towards the end. There were some of the highest turnover of an administration that you could imagine, and I think that probably hurt the success of the city towards the end as well.
You would hear stories about cabinet meetings where, all right, we're all in attendance, and sort of like who's going to be in the barrel today, and who's going to be in the crossfire today. And I think the longer he was in office, the less qualified and less competent, to be honest, cabinet members on his team were still in place. He went through, I think, 8 police chiefs. He went through police chiefs like they were Kleenex. I mean, the fact that the fact that he was such a demanding boss. Again, he was a workaholic. The stories were that he'd be bounding up to work 6 o'clock in the morning every day, but he had the same expectations that everybody else on his staff would be nose to the grindstone, shoulder to the wheel, nonstop, work. But again, he was very demanding, and I think in many ways became his own worst enemy.
Well, how does all of that tie? Go ahead, Brent. Jump in on that point.
Yet there are times when, if he's watching this, he's about to fall over. There are times when I kind of miss him. And there is a school levy campaign underway right now in Cleveland, and a bunch of business property owners are taking advantage of secrecy laws and in campaign financing, and they're spending a lot of money trying to defeat a school levy designed to try and to keep the Cleveland schools slowly getting better. And there is a lack of outrage over what is happening. And I thought, and I'm making a note of that and something I'm writing for this weekend. If Mike White was mayor, he would hunt these people down. He would find out who they are, and he would name them and then punish them. And part of me misses that.
Brent, on that point, in a press conference, and we do them now via Facebook because of live streaming because of COVID, I asked the mayor a week ago. I said, I'm aware that there are downtown business property owners involved. Obviously, people talk to me, but I can't get it on the record. And these are some of the same people who have sought benefits from the city for projects that are pushing against. And his reaction was, well, if you give me the name, then I'll say something about it. And I guess I'm surprised that you wouldn't use the bully pulpit, really, given how close it is. And this is sophisticated stuff. We know it's real money, and it hasn't been that hard to hear, or pick up the phone and call every developer and say, right on the spot, is it you? Are you behind it? Hold news conferences to do it. Mike White clearly would have done that. And I think that is a difference when you look at the legacies, but it's all connected because it's about the schools and something that the mayor embraced and brought forward. And here we are. Tom?
Mark, you're working, you're at the table, so your sources are probably more current and on top of it than anybody that I talk to. But my understanding is that now there is a general awareness among the mayor and the top officials at City Hall of the identity of the people behind this. And again, maybe because of the way that these secrecy laws for the dark money are constructed, there's no way to identify them and put the public spotlight on them, which is certainly what they deserve.
But
well,
see,
the mayor
Mike,
could pick up the phone and call people.
But Mike would have been the bulldog. Mike would have been the bulldog on their ankles. Mike would have called them out. Mike would have put them on TV, put them on radio, put them in the newspaper. He would have called them out. And I think that's the difference between the two administrations. Frank Jackson is a little more laid back in that regard, but Mike would be on him.
Yeah, I don't think there's a bigger issue, one that ties back to his legacy than this, because the schools, you can argue whether their progress, and they've all made progress, is enough to justify the levies, but graduation, time in school, attendance, things are up, reading levels. Yes, they get big grades for making a change because they started in the basement, but all of that changes November 2nd, because that levy expires at the end of the year. It was a massive levy to begin with. It has paid for a lot. They have done consolidation. The business community, i.e. The Greater Cleveland Partnership, which today is still the big power among businesses, endorsed the levy, but they played along. They were a little reluctant. They made them beg for the supper there for that endorsement. And they're funding the campaign to pass the levy. But if it doesn't pass, it really it sets back almost pre-Mike White days, because without that funding, I'm not sure what the schools are going to do. And I think that'll be one issue that the people watching tonight will all have to cover and watch as part of that thread that ties back to 1989.
But one of the keys to Mike White, I've always said this, one of the keys to him is the schools. One of the keys is education, because you can't talk with him. I mean, personally, I've talked with him personally or professionally without him mentioning certain teachers by name. I know those teachers because I had the same teachers. And he will tell you, were it not for those teachers and were not for the school system, he would not be where he got to be. And I think that's key. I think the whole school thing is very key to his development and his philosophical thought.
Well, it gave him cover, if nothing else, to say, I did what the best thing I could do for the schools was control it and pass levy. And now I'm downtown to from that idea that he's not doing much. Again, whether the schools have succeeded or not, some people will debate. Tom, go ahead.
Well, I understand that the pandemic has turned the whole world upside down, including the news media and how you do your job every day. But where has Mayor Jackson been on this school levy? Maybe I've just blinked and missed it, but I haven't seen a whole lot of resounding public statements about the importance of this levy. And were Mike White the mayor, I'm just guessing that COVID or no COVID, he would be out there with the largest megaphone he possibly could, trying to promote this and unite the community behind it.
There are paid ads and radio commercials with the mayor, but on your point, Tom, yes, why not drag the free media along, because they would follow COVID.
The campaign to beat this they might spend $1 million. They've done between 6 and 8 full color mailings to every household. They're spending serious money here.
Yes, and we'll move off this topic for now, but I do think that's going to be the biggest issue that connects. When we look at stadium, housing, the schools, economic development, airport, set all that aside for a moment. In the mayor's legacy to the city of Cleveland, is there one of those things that jumps out? What is it? What do we say he left us? I mean, buildings are just buildings, but what was that the groundwork for something bigger and ongoing, as each now succeeding mayor has to deal with how to pay for gateway stadiums? What is it that the mayor, Michael R. White, left us? Tom?
Well, I guess we could make this a split personality thing. The positive, the good, the beneficial Mayor White left a good example for how a strong mayor sets an agenda, tackles any big problems, any big issues, any big personalities, and leads. The flip side of the Mike White coin, of course, is his personality issues and his difficulty and thin skin and inability to accept criticism. Obviously, hangs over his ultimate legacy as a tarnish on everything that everything he did manage to accomplish. What is named after Mike White in the city? There's one elementary school, I think, that is merging with a Montessori school. Maybe this goes back to your comment, Brent, about the word beloved and Mike White maybe not being used together very often. Is there anything else in the way of a tangible legacy in the city that you're aware of that has a Mike White identity on it?
No, I think you're right. I don't think there is. There's Voinovich Park, and there's lots and lots of Stokes, you know,
Yeah.
remembrances, but there is not. And my views, Mike White came along and Cleveland, he is exactly what Cleveland needed after 10 years of George Voinovich. And Voinovich inherited an enormous fiscal problem, and the city was in default, took a long time. He was not a great visionary, didn't have a lot of charisma, but he was a problem solver. And that is, Voinovich is exactly what the city needed at the time. And I would argue that Mike White was the perfect transition because things were slowing down. Voinovich got out. He knew it was time to leave. Mike White did bring a sense of energy and vision and boldness that the city needed at the time. I don't want to pile on it. We've talked about his third term a lot, but at that moment in 1990, he was, in hindsight, he was exactly what Cleveland needed.
Yeah. Leon, what sticks out for you when set aside the building?
The school that's named Michael R. White Elementary School, that used to be Miles Standish. That's the school he went to. That's the school I went to. That's a school that's right around within sight of the house he grew up in. So that's part of it. But I think you have to look at Mike White in 1990s eyes. At the time he came along, and yeah, he could be tough on one end, and he could be efficient on the other hand, and he was something like, maybe I'm stretching it, but he was something like, from what I read about General George Patton in World War II. His personality was rugged, and he slapped the soldier, and they beat him up for slapping a soldier to get the soldier off his ass to do his job. But at the same time, when you needed somebody to win a tank battle, you called George Patton. Well, I think Mike White was a little bit of that. I think he's a little of this, and he's a little of that. And I think all of it together in the 1990s, generally speaking, was a positive, although it's hard to look at it in 2020 eyes and draw conclusions. You got to be there. You got to see where we were coming from, and you got to see where what George Voinovich did after Dennis Kucinich. We got on a roll, and then Mike White, I think, kept that roll going. And I think the city really, in the Mike White days, I think for the most part, we thought a lot better of ourselves. There was a survey that was done way back when that said 50% of Clevelanders wish they lived somewhere else. Now, I don't know if that meant in the suburbs or in another metropolitan area, but I think with the saving the Indians, keeping the Indians from moving to Tampa, and building Gateway, getting the Cavaliers out of Richfield back downtown, and getting the Browns' name back, I think he'll probably be known for that, and maybe even getting the schools back on a more solid footing from where they were before. I think that's what he'll be known for. But
and I think those are all fair points. I throw this out though. We have a situation, and it doesn't all fall to Mayor Michael R. White. But here we are 30 years later. We are still paying for stadiums and their renovations, and they are causing great distress financially, and the future is all up in the air again. We have a city that's still, poverty, one of the highest poverty rates in the country, and we have schools that we're still talking about the same way we did back then, and that seems to be one of the toughest things a mayor can change. Voinovich wasn't able to do it. Mayor White didn't change it. Mayor Jackson now has had 4 bites at the apple, and we're still struggling with those 3 or 4 points. Obviously, those are big issues. Racial issues continue to be a big deal. The crime, it's hard hearing Mayor Jackson talk about it. And when he's been there for 14 years, and we're still struggling with these same issues.
White flight out of the city. white flight and middle class flight out of the city. I mean, I don't know if any mayor can fix all of this. I mean, how many suburbs we got? 57 suburbs?
Yes, 56
56,
subdivisions.
56 suburbs
53.
around the city, and everybody, and so many people are running to the suburbs. Couldn't anybody fix it?
Yeah. And we have a commenter that's pointing out that they do see the racial issues as a big, I mean, one of the big reasons for some of these other problems, and it is a tough one. We're getting close. We're gonna wrap it up. I guess final thoughts. And if I can ask each of you to sort of say, all right, knowing what everything Mike White did, what does this almost next mayor, whether it's Jackson or someone else, where do they need to begin? Who or what type of mayor needs to be the right kind of mayor in 2021? Brent?
I think that the 2021 mayoral race will probably be the most important mayoral race since 1989. Speaking of 89, because we don't know how old Rust Belt cities are going to come out of this pandemic, and how Cleveland's downtown has always seemed to me, despite all the great things that are happening, it has to be fragile. And we're going to need someone with vision and this is a very important election. And I'm not blown away by what I've seen in the field of candidates now. Maybe there is someone, a Mike White that's going to emerge or someone like that, but really important election, Mark. I think you agree.
Yeah, and Tom, what do you see? Who's needed? What's the moment going to be like? And if there is one or two things they can take away from Mike White, what would it be?
Well, again, this election, I think, is going to be the most interesting and maybe intriguing election since Mike White was elected. And you just have to hope that somewhere in this field of somewhat known, familiar political names and lesser known aspirational candidates, that there is somebody in there with the best version of Mike White qualities, the vision and the energy, and maybe the outside the box thinking that the city seems to really need here to solve some of these chronic problems, which, again, if you list the 5 biggest problems, education, healthcare, housing, lack of jobs, same that they were when Carl Stokes was in office. So again, hopefully there's a candidate who can bring a lot of that to the table, because yes, these problems are really intractable and difficult, and maybe expecting too much for one person to be a savior.
And Leon, your final thoughts on that legacy and what we need going forward?
I think it's going to take a visionary. It's going to take somebody who is, as Tom said, think outside the box. In fact, I think it's going to take somebody who's going to throw away the box and build something new. I think there is a generally a good infrastructure in the city with the people and the ethnic groups and all of that. I think there's some strength there, but I think it's going to take somebody who is going to have to be a visionary, looking downrange, who may not even get credit for it for another 30 years, whatever he or she does. That's what I think is going to take for this city to be what we all want it to be.
Well, I hope we can all reconvene maybe after the next mayor's race, and we'll see what we got, and we'll compare this conversation to that reality. And I'll bring Karen back on if you've got a minute to unmute and wrap us up here. And I want to thank the people, first of all, for putting in questions. We did try to touch on them. Obviously, we could have spent hours and hours on every little element of all of this. But it was really helpful to have, the history that Brent still carries around, even in his old age, though I'm not far behind, and Tom and Leon taking us from the early days on. I appreciate it. You make being a moderator very easy because I can just say go and you did it. Karen?
Thank you guys so much. This was so informative, and like a lot of our participants are saying that they'd love to continue the conversations with themselves and with their families, and it was so informative. Thank you guys so much. Thank you all of our attendees for joining us. And I would also note that the next in this series, sort of continuing on in our mayoral theme of tonight, is going to be on Thursday, November 19th, on the influences of Henry George on Tom Johnson and other mayors as well. So we hope that some of you will join us for that. And thank you guys so much. This has been really, really lovely. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Done.